The news and news reports are always flooding our information stream, telling us about a new study or a new trial that's showing remarkable progress in treating some virus or disease, and eventually they hope to get that product to your local drugstore or your local hospital. But before it does that and it lands on the shelves of your local hospital or doctor's office, it has to get approved by the FDA, the US Food and Drug Administration. But how does this process work? How does a drug go from test phase all the way to the front shelves of your local Fred Meyers? So in this video, we're going to explain the entire clinical trial process from start to finish, and you can see how a drug goes from test phase to on the shelves. So before anything can happen in a clinical trial process, first a drug or vaccine must be developed, usually by some pharmaceutical company such as Pfizer, Moderna, or one of the hundreds of smaller pharmaceutical companies throughout the country. So then they need to develop the physical compound of this drug, whether it's in the form of a vaccine, a pill, or an ointment, and then they will produce that for the clinical trials, and it will enter the first step of the lengthy clinical trial process. So once the new compound has been developed into a physical form, this means it's either in the form of a pill, a vaccine, an ointment of some kind that you can rub on it, but once it's in a physical form of a product, it then enters the testing phase. And so in the testing phase, the first thing it must do is it has to be tested out by animals before it reaches human trials. And by doing this, the researchers can study the toxicity levels and side effects and gather just basic safety information on the drug before moving it to human trials. However, it is important to know that only about 12% of drugs ever actually make it past the preclinical stage. And this is one thing that animal rights activists have long been against these preclinical phase trials, because a lot of them are unsuccessful, which means harm has come to the animals. But so far they have been unsuccessful in making any meaningful reforms on the trial process, especially in the preclinicals. Phase 1 is the first of these human trials. Here in phase 1, the drug is going to be tested out on a range of either 20 to 80 people that are always volunteers, and it can be anywhere in between that range. And the primary goal of phase 1 is to determine 1, what the major side effects are in humans, 2, how the human body metabolizes the drug and how it's excreted, and then 3, just trying to get down the correct dosing and what dosage for different weight levels and different body types and body sizes is most effective for this drug. So throughout phase 1, participants are just constantly monitored, and their researchers are always looking at the data of what happens to these volunteers. So if the data shows that a large percentage of participants are suffering very, very negative side effects, and side effects that are actually worse than the disease that the drug was meant to treat, then usually the drug just stops at phase 1. It does not move on to further trials, because the whole point is to have an effective drug. But if the side effects are worse than the drug, then it's actually more of a negative than a positive. In phase 2, the trial moves to a larger sample size of participants, usually in the range from 100 to 300 people, and the primary purpose of this is to determine still the side effects of the drug on humans. Are there some things they missed, and is the side effects lessened with more accurate dosing? And then second, does the drug actually appear to work at all? For instance, if the drug's purpose is to treat Alzheimer's disease, does it actually appear to help with that at all? Or does it just not really have any effect at all? So in this phase, it lasts anywhere from a few months up to 2 years. So it's a much longer phase than phase 1. So they have a lot more time and a lot more people to monitor the data on. And what they're looking for, like I said, 2 major things in this one. 1, are there any side effects they miss? Any more long-term side effects that don't pop up until later? And then 2, does it actually help with the treatment that its purpose is meant for? So when the researchers are analyzing the data and looking at the data, if it appears like the drug just does not appear to have much effect at all on the disease, or if the side effects appear to outweigh the treatment on a large portion of participants, because again, they now have a much larger sample size to monitor, then they usually will kill the drug in phase 2. It does not move on to the next phase. And in this phase, only about 33% or 1/3 of drugs being tested do pass this phase and move on to the last phase of the trials. Phase 3 is the last step in human trials, and this phase also moves into a larger sample size, usually in the thousands, but it can range anywhere from 300 participants to 3,000 participants. This is also the longest trial phase, lasting from 1 year up to 4 years. Here, the goal is pretty much the same as in phase 2, and is to monitor the overall safety and side effects of the drug, along with its overall effectiveness in treating whatever it is it was meant to treat. So phase 3 is just going to be more accurate because it's dealing with a larger sample size and a larger timeline, so you're going to be able to see a lot more in the data. So if, when looking at the data, the researchers see that the drug appears to have some effectiveness in treating the disease or virus, and the side effects are somewhat mild, it will then move into the final approval process with the FDA and is now very, very close to going to the market. On average, about 30% of drugs will move past phase 3 onto the final FDA approval process. Very similar to phase 2, maybe just a little bit less percentage depending on what sources you look at, but overall about 1/3 will move on. And like in phase 2, many companies will see a great increase in their stock price, especially the smaller pharmaceutical companies, because they have a smaller market cap. So their stock price will shoot way up if they move on past phase 3, because now a new drug is nearly to the market. So that means a lot of value for that company. So after it passes phase 3, it now goes into more of a legal process known as the NDA process, and we'll talk about what that means here in a second. But from here, most drugs that make it to this point will go to the market. There's just a few legal steps and checks that need approval with the FDA first. So the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to file an official NDA, which is short for New Drug Application, to the FDA. And the NDA includes all the results and all the data from both the animal and human trials and how the drug was manufactured, along with information about how the drug behaves and how it interacts with the body. And this is then reviewed by a team at the FDA. The designated FDA team will then review the drug's labeling to make sure all the information about the drug is accurately communicated to the healthcare professionals and to consumers. And so they're making sure everything's matching up with the side effects and what goes into the drug, and that everything is on the same page so that information is accurate. And then finally, once it passes the labeling step here, the FDA will send a team to go inspect the manufacturing facilities and make sure everything there is in order for safe and secure manufacturing of the drug or product. And if the FDA team that inspects the manufacturing facilities, and even if there's some things that they would like them to change, usually they will make the changes, and once it gets to this stage, they just will ensure that it's safely manufactured. And after all that, usually the process that takes from start to finish anywhere from about 3 to 10 years, usually more towards the latter side, the drug will finally hit the shelves and go to market. However, that actually does not mean officially the entire process is finished, because there is still a fourth phase called the post-marketing phase. And it is in this phase where the FDA monitors any long-term effects that may have been missed or have just not seen enough time or data to develop. And so if you look on the FDA's own website, it actually claims that it is not possible to monitor all possible effects in the first 3 phases, so monitoring long-term effects of a drug is critical. The most common thing to happen is if some side effects are found later in the post-marketing phase, the new risks are going to be added to the drug's labeling, and the manufacturer must put out a notice to health advisors and to the public to let them know of the new risks. But in some cases, the use of the drug will actually be limited to certain groups if certain groups are found to have more risks or more adverse effects. And there are actually rare occasions where the drug will actually be completely withdrawn from the market if they find some very, very negative effects way later on in the post-marketing phase. In this phase, they do not really consider finished until 10 years after it begins. So that is pretty much the entire process in a nutshell, and that's how in the United States a drug goes from an idea all the way to the shelves of your local pharmacy.